It usually starts with confidence, the kind that doesn't feel loud at first but solid, unquestioned, almost automatic. An American steps off a plane, logs onto international Wi-Fi, looks around, and assumes, without even realizing it, that the world will adjust slightly to them. The language will bend, the rules will soften, the attention will arrive, because back home, it always does, and then something strange happens. Nothing. Welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, please subscribe, like my video, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next update. No special treatment, no fascination, no automatic authority, no invisible spotlight, just a world that keeps moving exactly the same way it did before they arrived. And that's the moment many Americans experience the most uncomfortable realization of their lives. The world doesn't revolve around them, and it never did. At first, it feels like a mistake. Maybe people didn't hear the accent. Maybe the confidence didn't translate. Maybe the enthusiasm got lost in translation. So they repeat themselves. Speak slower. Speak louder. Add more explanation. Back home, that usually works. Abroad, it doesn't. Instead, they're met with neutral expressions, short replies, or polite indifference. And that indifference hits harder than hostility ever could. Because when you're used to being centered, being treated as just another person feels like erasure. In many countries, Americans discover they are no longer the default reference point. Their holidays aren't universal. Their measurements aren't standard. Their jokes don't always land. Their opinions aren't automatically prioritized. And for some, that feels less like culture shock and more like an identity crisis. You see it in restaurants when the menu doesn't change to accommodate them. In shops when staff don't bend rules, just this once. In conversations when people disagree calmly and move on without needing validation. Americans are often raised in a culture that celebrates confidence, self-expression, and standing out. But much of the world values restraint, context, and blending in. And when those two systems collide, confusion quickly turns into frustration. There's a moment when the realization becomes impossible to ignore. It happens when an American expects recognition, maybe for their nationality, their knowledge, their way of doing things, and instead receives correction, or worse, indifference. They discover their passport doesn't carry the weight they assumed. Their opinions are treated as opinions, not facts. Their way isn't seen as better, just different. And this is where reactions split. Some Americans pause and adapt. They observe, they listen, they learn, but others push back. They argue that things should be easier, that systems should be more flexible, that people should be more accommodating. And when that doesn't happen, the frustration grows louder. You'll hear it in phrases like, "That's not how we do it in America," as if that sentence is meant to end the discussion. In many places, it doesn't even start one. Because outside the US, America is just one country among many. Influential, yes, but not central. And realizing that can feel like losing gravity. The world doesn't hate Americans. It simply doesn't orbit them. And that difference matters. In global spaces, Americans quickly learn that being confident doesn't guarantee being correct. Being loud doesn't guarantee being heard. And being familiar with your own culture doesn't mean you understand anyone else's. What makes this realization so difficult is that it's not dramatic. There's no big confrontation, no announcement, just a slow accumulation of moments where expectations don't match reality, where the world refuses to bend, where systems keep working without adjusting. And over time, that quiet resistance forces a choice: adapt or resent. Those who adapt come away changed, more observant, more patient, more aware that their way is just one of many. They learn that respect looks different everywhere, that humility travels better than confidence, and that listening earns more than explaining. But those who don't adapt leave convinced the world is wrong, that everyone else is difficult, that nothing makes sense outside their bubble. And that's the irony. The world doesn't revolve around Americans, and it never claimed to. That belief is internal, not universal. Once it dissolves, travel becomes richer, conversations become deeper, and cultures stop feeling hostile and start feeling complex. But until that realization happens, the shock remains. Because nothing unsettles a person faster than discovering they are not the center of the story they thought they were starring in. And that's only the beginning. Because once that realization fully sinks in, a second reaction often follows: embarrassment. Looking back on moments where assumptions were made, where confidence crossed into entitlement, where expectations quietly failed. And that embarrassment either hardens into defensiveness or opens the door to growth. Some Americans double down. They joke about it, dismiss it, claim other cultures are behind or too rigid. But others recognize something far more valuable, that stepping outside the center forces perspective. It strips away the comfort of familiarity and replaces it with awareness. That's why the most meaningful transformation doesn't happen when Americans are admired abroad, but when they're treated neutrally, when they're just another person in a crowd. Because that's when empathy develops. When you're no longer the default, you start noticing how systems actually work, how cultures protect their rhythms, and how respect is earned, not assumed. And in the end, the realization isn't humiliating, it's liberating. The world doesn't revolve around you, which means you're free to move through it without needing it to. And once Americans understand that, the world stops feeling unwelcoming and starts feeling honest. And then something even more uncomfortable happens: comparison. Americans start noticing how other foreigners move through the same spaces with ease. They watch Germans follow rules without complaint. They see Japanese tourists quietly adapting. They notice Africans, Asians, and Europeans adjusting without demanding accommodation. And slowly, it becomes clear that the friction isn't global, it's personal. This is where the realization sharpens. The world isn't reacting negatively to Americans because they're American. It's reacting neutrally. And neutrality feels hostile only if you're used to being centered, when no one rushes to explain things, when no one softens the rules, when no one changes tone just to make you comfortable. That's when the illusion fully cracks. Some Americans try to reclaim control by explaining America. They list achievements. They talk about influence, money, power, freedom. But outside the US, those things don't function as social currency. People care more about how you behave than where you're from. Respect is earned through awareness, not nationality. And the more that truth sinks in, the quieter the American becomes. There's a moment, usually subtle, when humility replaces defensiveness, when the American stops correcting accents, stops comparing systems, stops measuring everything against home. They begin asking instead of telling, listening instead of explaining, observing instead of judging. And suddenly, doors open, conversations flow, people soften. Not because America disappeared, but because entitlement did. But not everyone reaches that point. Some cling to resentment. They interpret fairness as hostility and equality as disrespect. They leave convinced the world is unfriendly, when in reality, it simply refused to prioritize them. And that belief follows them home, reinforcing the bubble that caused the shock in the first place. What makes this realization so powerful is that it doesn't just change how Americans see the world, it changes how they see themselves. Being one of many instead of the center forces maturity. It teaches that influence doesn't guarantee importance, and confidence doesn't guarantee understanding. And here's the final twist. Once Americans truly accept that the world doesn't revolve around them, they often enjoy it more. Travel becomes lighter. Interactions feel more genuine. The pressure to represent something disappears. You're no longer carrying a national identity into every room, just a human one. That's the lesson most people miss. The world not revolving around you isn't a loss of status. It's an invitation to learn, to adapt, to exist without expectation. And once that realization lands, it never really goes away. Because the world was never supposed to revolve around anyone. And the moment you stop expecting it to, you finally get to experience it as it is: complex, indifferent, fair, and unexpectedly freeing.